Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show, where I've got guest Dr. Aaron Rabinowitz, who's recently defended his PhD thesis, which is to do with philosophy of luck, which is the topic that we're going to be talking about today. People who have watched for a while probably seen Aaron on before talking about other things. You know, I think we talked about moral realism 3 years ago or something now, when I was at the start of my philosophy journey. And I think you've been sort of like teaching and working towards this PhD that whole time. Is that right?
Yep, pretty much. This is a topic that I've been obsessed with for going on 15 years now, and spent the last 4.5 years working on a PhD in education with a focus in moral education, with a specialization on teaching people about luck, how to help them better understand this concept and its role in their lives.
So I'm gonna say, for people who want to go like more in depth on this than we get into today, you've got like a series of great episodes on your show, where you kind of walk through your dissertation step by step. So it might be a little bit less detailed, but maybe cover a little bit of different ground here today as well. I'll link to that in the description. But the first question then is, why philosophy of luck?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons. Personally, I got obsessed with it because of a chapter article by Thomas Nagel in the book Mortal Questions called Moral Luck, where he essentially, I think, makes a correct case that everything is luck all the way down, which is part of the sort of thesis of my dissertation, that we should teach that to everybody, essentially. So his argument, luck pilled me, convinced me that this was true. And then I didn't exactly know where to go with that for a long time. So I taught, ethics at the undergrad level for many years before I went into my PhD. Every semester I would talk about, I would teach that chapter. I would go through the arguments with my students. It was the most compelling thing I think that I ever got to teach, and that stuck with them the most out of everything in that class. And over the course of that, and then the PhD, I sort of developed a perspective about how we can teach people that view in a way that is healthier than what we are currently doing when we teach people about luck. And in that process, I pulled in a bunch of stuff from psychology and politics to make the case that doing this disabuses people of a cluster of really harmful illusions centered around the illusion that we live in a just world, and then including also the illusion of free will, divine justice, and meritocracy.
Awesome. So you use the phrase luck pilling, and or if people listen to or read to any of your work, this phrase is kind of all over the place. What is luck pilling?
Yeah, so luck pilling, which is very internet languagey, I recognize, derives from a movie that I enjoyed despite its somewhat harmful effects on society, The Matrix, where you take the pill. The pilling suffix, I think, really just means awakening someone to, or helping someone internalize a taboo truth, some sort of truth that society tends to be resistant to, or that our psychology tends to be resistant to. So the phrase getting woke is synonymous in that kind of sense with pilling somebody. And you see lots of uses of pilling online: red pilling, black pilling, etc. Luck pilling, ironically, turns up in one other community, which is incels, who use it as a springboard into black pilling. So luck pilling to me means helping somebody internalize in a healthy way that everything about them and their world and their experiences is luck all the way down. And by healthy, I mean you don't destroy their motivation or their sense of morality. You increase their sense of generosity and humility and compassion, and actually make them more effective at engaging in the things that they care about, including social change. So that's what it means to me.
And so I guess a few of the other kind of like pilled communities, like red pill communities, black pill communities, where people become like doomers and don't care about anything and stuff. I guess you talk about how your work might have relevance to those communities as well. Do you want to sort of expand a bit on what you see that relevance as being for people who are in those kind of worldviews, or maybe even people who, I've done a lot of stuff on religion, so people sometimes come across my stuff through like the meaning crisis as well, which is sort of adjacent to all those things.
Yeah, and I wrote a piece recently for The Skeptic about the meaning crisis for men in particular. And I do think about this a lot because I've spent a fair bit of time working on manosphere stuff, incel stuff, as it connects to spiraling into conspiracy theories, other sort of harmful worldviews, while still trying to argue for something that is a very, like, I would say, minority position these days, which is that we should have compassion for these individuals and view them the same way we view people who get pulled into cults and stuff like that. And so the way this ties to the luck pilling stuff is, on one level, society creates a bunch of legitimizing myths to deny the reality of things being luck all the way down. And when those legitimizing myths get undercut or challenged, those individuals who are dependent on them for their stability are at higher risk of spiraling into these spaces. So the idea is, when you luck pill somebody in an incel space, the first thing you do is convince them that it's actually true, that whether or not you're going to be successful finding a partner comes down to luck, and that society is lying to you about that. And once you've got them there, then you black pill them into thinking that nothing matters. And so what I instead want to do is help people understand that everything is luck, but that can lead in a different direction than nihilism if it's scaffolded properly. Right. And probably, I was going to say, we should probably define luck before we get too far into this, right?
Yeah. That's what I was gonna. So, I was going to ask you about the main views of luck. I don't know if you want to kind of like give a brief definition before getting into the weeds, though. Just maybe like because I understand you kind of approach this from an ex-phil standpoint a little bit as well, about what do people think about the concept of luck, like what do non-philosophers think about the concept of luck as well.
Yeah, and I divide the dissertation into 4 chapters by like disciplines. So the first chapter is primarily philosophical arguments, and then psychological arguments, and then political arguments, and then the pedagogy that I think follows from all of that. But yeah, I do think it is important that philosophers engage with the psychological research on the concepts that they are discussing, so they can understand, whether they're arguing for something that might actually be really harmful in the way that it is being acted out by people in the world. But the philosophical accounts of luck, there are essentially 3 main accounts and then hybrid versions of those accounts that try to mix and match, glom things on. The 3 main accounts are chance, lack of control, or I'm just going to call it the control account, and then modal fragility, or the modal account of luck. The modal account is the most philosophically complex, and I think collapses into the other 2 accounts for the most part, is more popular amongst epistemic philosophers than moral philosophers. We don't have to get in the weeds on that, I don't think, unless people really want to. The 2 main accounts I think that people have in their minds, and they tend to just psychologically, I think people just tend to run these 2 together in general when they're thinking about this concept, and don't really disambiguate it unless you ask them to, which is, I think, common for a lot of the way that human beings engage with concepts. So there's the chance account and the control account. The chance account, there are, as you might imagine, 10 to 20 different sub accounts of that, right? There's the more common probabilistic chance account, which is it's unlikely, it's unpredictable, it's indeterminate, etc., etc. There's no agreement about which kind of chancy they mean, but that's your kind of classic chancy. Then there's by chance, which is a phrase that the luck egalitarians choose to use, but I argue in the dissertation very clearly collapses into the control account. What they mean by when something happens by chance of birth or something, what they mean is it was beyond your control. It's brute luck in their language. So then you have the control account, or the lack of control account, which comes from folks like Nagel, like the moral luck arguments, and essentially is based on the core intuition that I think is pretty universal, which he calls the control condition, which is you should only hold people responsible for things that are under their control. And then if you apply that consistently, it appears that nothing is under people's control in the way that you can hold them responsible, such that they deserve certain outcomes. So we can think of that as the problem of luck, or the pervasiveness problem that kind of follows from consistent application of the control account of luck. I think the actual objections to the control account of luck are very weak, and that overall it is I think, arguably much better version of luck, or better understanding of the account of luck than the alternatives. And then there's a bunch of concerns that arise from that if you buy that idea.
And then you also mentioned, like a more superstitious account is the main approach that you take to dealing with like superstitious accounts of luck, to sort of, just argue for like broadly conceived naturalism or something and say these views don't really make that much sense? Or is there a more specific approach to that's kind of constrained to the luck piece?
Yeah, so I think, and we have a little bit of psych research that we've been doing that backs this up. There are two different concepts in people's minds. There's non-superstitious luck and there's superstitious luck. Non-superstitious luck is the mix of chance and control intuitions. Superstitious luck is really interesting, actually. And I don't think we should brush it aside, even though we should acknowledge that it is, in fact, superstitious. And that's a self-identifying term for people who I've talked to who believe that they have this kind of ability. The way we can, I think, understand the central through line, there's a bunch of different versions of this, but the main idea in superstitious luck is the individual has some kind of control or capacity such that they can take an event that is recognized as being chancy in the probabilistic sense and make it less chancy to the point where it is under their control. So the person who is lucky enough to be able to roll that 1 out of 100, essentially. And that can be because they have a relationship with the universe. It can be a special ability they have. It could just be innate. Who knows? But that's the central through line for all the superstitious accounts. And that they're really interesting because they are harmful. First of all, they correlate with things like problematic gambling behavior and other harmful behaviors. And they correlate, it seems like, with religious thinking. So the kind of magical thinking that occurs when every one of us does that kind of superstitious luck behavior is the same kind of magical thinking that goes into belief in divine justice and related religious beliefs, in my opinion.
Yeah. So then in terms of like the main kind of, or I don't know if you'd want to phrase it as like the correct view of luck that you sort of like argue for, could you spell out in a bit more detail what that looks like and, why, the main ways people like kind of resist that view and how you respond to them?
Sure. Yeah. So as with all conceptual arguments, there's no clear-cut account. There's no agreement amongst philosophers about what are the right criteria for assessing what is the better account of X, right? Whatever it is, it can be a mix of intuitions, a mix of arguments, a mix of appeals to common usage, etc. So I think by all of those different versions of arguing for one concept over another, I think the control account is superior because of the strength of this control condition intuition, and because of the fact that as a result, it applies to every situation in which an individual would attribute something to luck. So it coheres, I think, with the most amount of our intuitions about what is and isn't luck, in contrast with, for example, the chance account. If we look at the probabilistic chance account, for example, if that's all we mean by luck, there's a bunch of situations where we think that someone is lucky, but it doesn't meet that criteria. It's not unlikely. So, for example, if you're born rich, you're likely to die rich. That's just a fact of our reality at the present moment. And I think most people would say, if you're born rich, you are lucky because you are more likely to live a life of being wealthy and die wealthy, right? You can talk about the complexities of that luck, but in general, we would recognize that as luck, but it's not unlikely in any real sense that I can see, other than the sense that like the vast majority of humans aren't born rich. But we could conversely just say the vast majority of humans are born low socioeconomic status and die low socioeconomic status, and that is bad luck from start to finish and very predictable.
Have you had any like philosophers kind of engaging directly with the arguments that you've given, since because I've not been up to date on, where you've been publishing or who, what kind of people might have been responding to you and stuff. Have philosophers been kind of like taking objection to the way you've divided up the conceptual landscape here or the arguments that you've given in any particular ways?
Not so far, and that's partly because I've been focused on getting the dissertation finished, and the hope is to try to turn it into a book, and possibly journal articles as well. I have spoken with a lot of the people who are doing work in this area, like Greg Caruso, Duncan Pritchard, Thomas Nadelhofer, Levy, and generally speaking, they provided various different kinds of pushback that I would say I address in the article or in the dissertation, in those conversations. But there weren't any pushbacks that felt novel to me or substantially defeating in any way. And I have a philosophy professor from Rutgers on my dissertation committee who did a lot of vetting of the philosophy sections to make sure that the claims seemed coherent and well sourced. So you'd ask about objections. The main objections to the chance account fall into a couple of different categories. Your first bucket is specific objections, counterexamples to the chance account, cases where it seems, or the control account, excuse me, cases where it seems like the control account doesn't give the right answer intuitively.
Okay.
Then there are some objections by a guy named Hales, which are supposed to be to all accounts of luck. And he claims that like every account fails by this, and therefore we should take an error theory approach to luck, like you do. And then there's the whole separate bucket of, okay, I don't have a counter argument, but if everybody believes this bad thing is going to happen, and or this is just too demanding. There's the classic, like, what you're asking for free will or moral responsibility is just too demanding, which I side with Singer on that one, that demandingness is not itself an objection in this context. But the counterexamples that are given, I think themselves are pretty weak. There are things like sunrise, some like cases where essentially it doesn't seem under your control, but people intuitively still wouldn't say it's luck. So if I asked you, is it luck that the sun rose today the way it did yesterday, and that it will rise the same way tomorrow?
I don't know what I'd say, to be honest. I mean, I can see like contexts where I would say yes and contexts where I would say no. Like I think my like individual use for word like luck is really polysemous. Like I can't see clear criteria that I personally apply, if that makes sense. I think so. Like I could kind of tell a story for myself, I think, where I would say yes, and I think I could tell a sort of plausible story I'd buy as well, where I'd like say no. Maybe I'd be feeling like super disagreeable or something, and I'd be like, I want to nitpick someone over concepts, or maybe I would just be feeling really I don't know, a sense of gratitude, and I wanted to express it somehow. And that when I think about my own use, that's how I'd go with that. But
yeah, and basically you can prime people easily in that direction is my argument. So we've also done a little research on like what people call luck versus not, and given them scenarios. And the sunrise one, pretty consistently, most people will say is not luck. But I think it's a very weakly held intuition, essentially. What's going on there is there's a secondary criteria within all of the plausible accounts of luck, which is the significance condition. For something to be luck, it has to be significant to somebody in some way. People don't intuitively remember that the sun consistently rising every day is very significant for all life on the planet, essentially. But if you remind them of that, and like how lucky we are to be on a planet that has a consistent rotation, that we're not living in the 3-body problem, for example, like you can very easily get them to recognize that is also a case of good luck.
I suspect something like that is what I'm imagining in the two cases as well, because I'm sort of thinking, well, just like with no context, it would seem like a very bizarre thing for me to say. But then if I'm like, well, you woke up and you're feeling this way and you want to express that gratitude and it's significant to you in that way, right? Then I might be like, yeah, I want to express luck now, or use the vocabulary of luck.
And I do think that it is a really helpful vocabulary for expressing both gratitude and humility in that way. So essentially that's like the most commonly cited counterexample that people sort of take as a knockdown counterexample. Then there's ones that are thrown around like inheriting your parents' wealth. So like you and in most of the other cases where people make objections in this form, they often covertly just beg the question by assuming the chance account, by essentially saying this thing is predictable and therefore it can't be luck, or intuitively doesn't feel like luck.
Yeah. I guess you can kind of conceptualize it in that way. So if you already hold to one of these views quite strongly, it'd be very easy to think about one of those cases and provide a kind of story about how your account relates to that conceptual deployment, right? And then it gets into that hard philosophical methodology problem of, so then how do you avoid doing that and kind of decide between the accounts on offer here?
Yeah, so there's a couple of, I think, useful intuitional sort of expansions that I go through. One of them is sort of formulated based on the Nagel kind of arguments. So let me back up for a second. I think
Sure.
I want to just give what the philosophy person on my committee thought was the strongest of the like intuitive walkthroughs of the argument here, and then we can talk about the sort of formal theory behind that, right? So, I'm gonna play the game on you since you're here and get to be tortured, right?
Okay.
Pick anything in your life that you feel like wasn't determined or caused or like entirely pervaded by luck. Something you did that you believe was under your control.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe like recovering from ACL surgery with like a decent outcome.
Okay.
Yeah.
So having a good outcome from your surgery. So I assume to do that you had to make a bunch of good choices, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So you can zero in on like. So what was your reason for recovering? What was your reason for wanting to recover in that way?
I think just because I wanted to be able to do the activities that you can do with like a healthy knee, sort of unhindered by the surgery or the previous injury.
Okay. So what would you say was sort of the feature of you, right? We have choice in theory, right? And we have competing reasons for the different choices.
Yeah.
You were compelled by one set of reasons, I would say, more than the other one. What features of you as an individual do you feel like made it such that you were more likely to be influenced by those reasons than the other reasons?
Yeah. Probably enjoying the outcome more than, sort of I would enjoy not putting myself through the pain of the rehab or whatever. So enjoying being able to do those activities in the future, or the possibility, thinking that there's a very high probability of doing that if I put myself through the kind of short-term pain of the rehab or something. So that just valuing those things, I suppose, over and above valuing the pleasure of not putting myself through the pain or something.
And would you say that you are the sort of like you chose to be the sort of person who valued those things in that way?
I mean, that to some degree and not to some degree. Like I think it's kind of very complicated, but I think that sometimes people think of, choosing what their character's like in these very like simple agentic like terms of as if choosing like values that they have or character traits that they have is as simple as like making a choice to just pick, like a really arbitrary, like flipping a coin or something.
Right. A radically free choice.
Yeah. I don't think it's like that. And it's hard to say though what exactly I think about the interplay of those things, like the things that I would consider myself responsible for that have shaped me and the things that haven't shaped me. I think that probably if I follow the chain, it will get to places that aren't like creditable to me, right? Like fundamentally, the story is going to bottom out in things that aren't creditable to me. But I don't know exactly what I would consider the interplay to be between like the things I chose or was involved in or not.
And I think what we can argue is if you just consistently apply the regress there, right? So for that question of choice, if the answer is yes, we can just ask, what was your reason for choosing to develop that kind of character? Well, I watched my ex-brother not do that and be in pain a bunch, and that motivated me, or, like whatever it was, you keep following that chain back. Like you said, you recognize that it's going to quickly bottom out in a part of your life where no one thinks you had control over anything. So this is where this argument overlaps with, I wouldn't say sort of totally collapses into the argument of free will, but is related to, and I think illuminates and helps us better understand the psychological implications as well as the philosophical debates around free will. Because
go
ahead. No, you go.
I was going to say, like, do you think that this regress argument would work for both the probabilistic or chancy account of luck and the control account? Because I was thinking, suppose that, like, you go through that, you get to all the initial reasons, and they're not kind of creditable to your agency or something in some way. I mean, you could kind of understand that in either terms, right? And it would still go through. Or is there a particular? Is there something you're thinking of where it has to be the control account?
No, you're totally right. And like the reason for using the control account is not so that I can win the regress argument, essentially, right? Which is the short answer to your question. And now there's a really cool sort of more complicated answer to that. So the formal, this guy Kaufman, who's actually an opponent of my position, lays out attempts to try to make sense of what's going on in the regress argument, and he formalizes it into what he calls the luck infection thesis, which I don't totally love because it suggests that like there are spaces in the universe where luck didn't exist and then luck pervaded it, whereas I think that everything in the universe is pervaded by luck at all times from the Big Bang onward. But essentially the idea is, if you are he puts it more narrowly than I would. He puts it like, if you're able to do X is the result of luck, then you're doing X as the result of luck. Right. So if your capacity is the result, right. So it's essentially that like whether determinism or indeterminism doesn't actually matter in this context. It's just, prior things cause things. So he opposes that thesis, specifically with regard to the control account, and he gives the following scenario, and I'm very curious to hear your unmolested intuitions about this scenario. He describes a situation where he gets off work 5 minutes early, goes to pick up his kid from school. Because he gets there 5 minutes early, he's lucky enough, and he acknowledges he's lucky enough to be there in time, and he sees that his kid is going to get hit by a car.
Right.
And he runs out into the street and saves the kid. He argues that it was not luck that he saved the kid.
Yeah, I don't know that I buy that. Like, I reckon lean towards if you ask me on a survey, I would probably tick the agree box or something for like he was lucky that he saved the kid or something, knowing all the details of that story. I don't know how other people would answer or think about this, but that's how I would think about it. But also, I guess, and this will come into maybe one of my questions that I've got later, but my overall sort of philosophical commitments make me a little bit skeptical of like generalizing from these sorts of cases. So even if this was, even if I bought his intuitions here, I'd probably have problems with like saying that this says that I can like generalize to prescriptive uses of luck for everyone everywhere, and the metaphysics of luck from a case like that. I would have a hard time doing that personally.
Yeah, I think that's a fair concern to have. I think the example is really illuminating on a couple of fronts that you've sort of raised questions about here. So first of all, this is another like actual attempt at a counter example to the control account, right? I would argue that if he's correct, then he's giving something that like undermines my view. I think he begs the question still in a technical sense in the argument, because he basically says, if I'm in the position with the ability to save the kid, it's not it's a matter of a coin toss that I'm actually going to do so or not, which again, I think assumes the probabilistic account, right?
Well, it's trying to lead people's intuitions in that direction. I think that this is where it, the thing I was saying about metaphilosophy and the role of these intuitions and thought experiments kind of comes in. Because I mean, I don't have data on this, but I suspect in this case, if you were to ask a bunch of people and kind of like phrase the question in different ways, they would just answer it in different ways. So if you're like, I'm there in the car and I can see the kid walking out into the road, so I get out and stop them. Is that lucky? I think you probably get more. I mean, this would be an interesting like
Mhm.
Excel type thing. You probably get more responses that were like, well, that's not luck. But then you said, and now you find out, that I got off work, a meeting ended 15 minutes early, so I drove there early to see it. Now what do people say? And then I suspect that you'd get people lean towards now it's lucky or something. Now I don't know,
Right.
obviously, how we don't have that data, and how you would interpret it
We
would
have a
be
little
kind
bit
of up
of it.
for grabs. But
We
okay,
don't have side by side stuff, but we've started
yeah,
to do a little preliminary research on this as well. And I think the initial evidence suggests that most people are going to see this as a case of luck, even sort of just simply described.
okay, interesting.
Just because of like, think about it. If you're a parent and you save your child's life, of course you're
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
feel lucky, right? Like, as I argue in the dissertation, I think parents would trade a winning lottery ticket for the chance to save their kid in that context. And so I think by our intuitive standards, it seems like luck. But I also think it highlights a point you've been making, which is in cases where a non-chancy event is the result of a chancy event, right? A probabilistically chancy event, there does appear to be a kind of chance infection thesis that is
Right.
similar to the control infection problem,
Yeah.
right? Where basics, I mean, I'm terrible at math, but like if the first event is very unlikely, then the second event is that unlikeliness times, whatever the likelihood of that second event is, right?
Sure. For independent
So
events.
right. Don't make me do math, please.
Yeah.
I'm an ethicist, dear God. So the point I guess I'm making is even if you buy the narrower chance account of luck instead of the broader control account, it
Yeah.
still seems like you have a chance infection problem that spreads most everywhere. I just think that the control account actually better focuses our intuitions on the problem of control, which is why luck matters in our lives psychologically.
I think that is, I mean, maybe I'm being infected by the free will debate here, but I think that's how I think about some of these debates. Is it maybe in terms of like responsibility and like just desserts or something and things like that? I think that's the main intuitions that I have that kind of apply to these cases. I think come from those sorts of things, which I think are basically related to questions of control, right?
Yeah,
In
so let's
my
talk.
view. But
Can we
yeah,
talk some about the psychology research? Because I think
yeah,
like this
sure.
is really where this is key.
And I have
Um,
a set of questions under the just
oh,
world
yeah.
illusion. So if this comes under this, is that the direction we're going in, or
Well,
you guys?
let me just
Yeah,
briefly
feel
at
free.
least say, I think it's worth noting that the research suggests that the free will illusion itself is an ad hoc rationalization for the desire to punish and
Right.
to
Okay.
make yourself feel like someone deserves to suffer so that you have less psychological damage from causing that suffering.
Right.
So with that, we can dive into any other questions, but like I do think that it is really important for philosophers of free will to understand that research if they're going to talk about this stuff and not sort of just stay in the land of theory.
Yeah, I'd love for you to expand a bit more on some of that because I'm not familiar with it, but I've heard, what I am familiar with is sort of like in jurisprudence and stuff. People talk about, what's the correct theory of justice, for example, and similarly in theology debates, right? People talk about what's the correct theory of justice in terms of what God would do, or think about the afterlife and stuff. And I have tended to find that so again, this is just my experience. It's not necessarily great data, but I've tended to find that people have quite arbitrary sort of like views about punishment that with just a little bit of kind of like probing and reflective kind of equilibrium about some cases and things, they're very willing to move more towards like theories of justice that are more like restorative or more kind of that the punishment can often seem quite arbitrary, and it's not and I don't know where that's coming from. Like, is it just conditioned into people, or is it some human psychological universal or something? I don't really know, so I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So I mean, if my view is correct, right, then one of the main psychological drivers of this is what you're referencing here, the just world illusion, and the cluster of things that centers around it. Folks may have heard of this before in terms of the language of just world belief, but that's a bit of a misnomer because it implies conscious belief, and a lot of folks think, well, I don't consciously believe that my world is just, so I'm not susceptible to this. But this is more of a felt or sometimes unconscious need, a need or desire to have your primarily your personal world feel just. So you can even acknowledge that, like, on the other side of the world, there's a bunch of injustice. But here in my little bubble, like, things are relatively just. This is something that's been researched for a long time as a sort of driver of weird, often harmful behaviors like victim blaming. So we hear that phrase thrown around a lot these days. One of the major plausible motivators is blaming the victim. Feeds the two sort of foundational drives behind the just world illusion, which I think are fairness and control. So you want the world to seem fair, and you want the world to feel controllable, and primarily you want the world to seem fair because that makes it seem more controllable a lot of the time.
Right.
What's really at issue here is the controllable part. A lot of the, like the illusion of control, as this is sometimes described, right? The feeling that the world is more controllable than it actually is, just like when you have superstitious luck. So, if you can say that the person caused the behavior, you might not use the word deserve explicitly, but if you can say they caused the behavior by walking in the wrong place, wearing the wrong clothing, doing this or that, then you can say, well, I won't do that. I'll avoid that behavior. And so I am not at risk of harm in the way that they are.
Right. And so the idea here for your view would be because of the regress of sort of like chancy events. So if you take a case where you might victim blame someone, it's hard to come up with a case that isn't like awful, intuitively. So I can only think of awful cases. But if I think of
a test, a student fails a test, right, this is education land, right?
Yeah. So you might think, if they had done something differently, prepared better, they could have read the rules of the exam more carefully, and they wouldn't have brought that weird calculator in that got them banned or something. I don't know. And so you kind of credit it to them that it's their fault in some sense. But then the idea of the regress is that, well, you sort of like chase back the reasons that led to that decision. You get to something that's outside of their control, such that even with the best will in the world, they couldn't have like controlled or set right the kind of action. Is that the broad? And then that undermines like the sense in which they're blameworthy. Is that the argument? Or
right by undermining attributions of deservingness. So a lot of this stuff comes out of attribution theory, which is the psychological research into how humans explain events, how they attribute causes to events, and how they act or think based on those attributions. So just world illusion produces certain kinds of harmful attributions of causality, which produce these harmful behaviors like victim blaming. Similarly, attributions of free will are tied to conservatism, are tied to the desire to punish, and create a permission structure for doing those things. The divine justice illusion provides a backstop. You've done religious world stuff, right? So what is the number one counter argument to the problem of evil?
Well, I mean, skeptical sort of theism I get often, or at the minute, or so God has reasons. For all we know, God has some reasons that are kind of like higher than ours and we can't know. Or I get like axiology responses. So there are some values that are only expressible in a world with these kind of the kind of suffering that we experience, with some people even claiming that some of the goods of like the Holocaust are somehow better than a world without the Holocaust or something, which that's sort of an extreme end of those views. I don't know which, I'm guessing you're going for the latter there, or
I think the one that I hear most common when you get pushed on things like natural evil, for example, is free will tied to original sin.
Demon free will and the tornadoes. Is that what you're going for?
Yeah.
People free will and sin. Yeah.
Well, the world has fallen because of our free will, essentially.
Yeah, sure.
So I point this out just to show how these illusions are mutually reinforcing, right? The divine justice illusion can provide an explanation for all of this horrible suffering, like you're saying, by being like, God's going to make it good in some kind of way. Right. And when you're pressed on like, how could God make something so arbitrarily terrible turn into something good? They'll either say God works in mysterious ways, or that thing is there because of the fallen nature of our world, because of human free will. And we need free will in order to have the good things that we were describing. Right. So.
So something I find quite interesting here is, obviously, I think a lot of these sorts of theists exist who have fairly harmful views about justice that kind of are informed by their theological commitments. But something I've come across is there's quite a lot of theists out there as well whose intuitions about justice have been shaped by like reflecting on the theological question. So I'm thinking of like universalists and like people who've read a lot of like David Bentley Hart and stuff. And I think that a lot of those people would be very sympathetic to some of the things that you're saying about like agency and control, or even like the political consequences of your views, like not being to punish people but to try and like fix things and set them right if there's a problem. And I wonder if you would be sympathetic to some theistic views that were like compatible with these like other commitments that you have about ways of interpreting, or would you say there's like just a fundamental plot hole there because, you know, why would God make a world where it was all chancy? Like it doesn't really make sense under theism.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, because I do think there's important like historical connections between our modern world and the illusions that I talk about, including the meritocracy illusion, which we haven't talked about as much.
Yeah.
And it is that is literally founded in the debate between universalists and non-universalists about salvation. Here's what's going to happen. And I want to put a pin in. I want to come back to the psychology of deservingness, because that's a real linchpin here. Because you know what you were saying earlier there about how these free will debates sort of bottom out in feelings of like deservingness. That I think correct, and that deservingness is one of the things we want to move away from as hard as possible. But let me talk about the universalism question. I think it's a great question. I'm going to first appear very sympathetic to the universalists and then have some less happy words for them. First of all, I am sympathetic to them as the best religious option there is, right? In the sense, and like the objection to them is the reason that like modern capitalism sucks so badly. Because essentially, literally what happens is, you know, the Ronald Reagan of theology, St. Augustine, says that God can't allow it can't be universal salvationism, because that would undermine God's omnipotence. God has to be the decider about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell, right? You're familiar. Down through the ages, you end up with the kind of Protestant Calvinism that says, well, if that's the case, right, if good works don't do anything, if they don't produce any effect on our salvation, why should we do them? And the answer they end up giving is, you know, it tells us roughly, gives us some idea of who is elect and who is not, because if you succeed, it's because God loves you, and if you fail, it's because God doesn't love you, and we get prosperity gospel and cosmic victim blaming, etc. But that split is, it comes down to like whether you need to believe that some people are destined to suffer and deserve that suffering, or that no one in that kind of sense deserves to suffer. Now, in that sense, I think, you know, universal salvationism, like the end of the good place, right, where they essentially work out a universal salvationist solution, right, is maybe your best case scenario if you are going to believe in God. But that being said, I still think universal salvationism is a legitimizing myth, which is the technical language that I talk about in the second chapter, coming from a couple of different theories for explaining how ideology influences behavior. Essentially, universalism is still a legitimizing myth because it's still a conception of divine justice that tells people that the suffering in this world will be made right in the next world.
Okay. So what if that was combined with the thesis that like there's a moral obligation to try and set them right in this world too? Then would that be more amenable? But you just, feel free to.
Yeah, it's again better than not,
but still.
But the psychological research suggests if you believe in the divine justice illusion, you are less likely to try to enact social change in this world. And I'm well aware of all of the social movements that were religious based. What I'm saying is, statistically speaking, individuals who are more likely to believe that God's going to sort things out are less likely to push for change in this world. So it is a status quo reinforcing system, even if it is more progressive leaning than any of the other status quo systems.
Right.
So in that sense, I would be like, okay, if that's what you need, but like if you really want to be the most likely to bring about the best lives for the most people in actual existence, better not to believe those things.
Right. That makes sense. And then you said you wanted to come back to the psychology of deservingness.
Yeah. So the legitimizing myths, the way they legitimize the status quo is through making people think that people deserve things, that they deserve their outcomes. Meritocracy is a classic example of this. You know, under a meritocracy in theory, you succeed or fail based on your merit, which means based on whether you did the things that made it so that you deserve to succeed or fail. And like what that is has changed over time a little bit. Nowadays, it's very effort focused, right? If you fail in our society, it's because you didn't work hard enough. If you believe that we live in a meritocracy, that's the only answer to the question, essentially.
Yeah.
And that leads to lots of problems, lots of self-blame, lots of suppressed anger that then boils up in January 6th kind of situations. So the way that all of this works is deservingness, and the research on deservingness is also really fascinating, because I think philosophers spend a lot of time talking about just desserts, but not a lot of time, again, looking at this research. There's a common intuition or assumption, a conventional wisdom about deservingness attributions, which is that they make us more ethically consistent. So the idea would be, in your thinking fast and slow kind of way, in situations where you need to make a moral judgment quickly and you don't have enough information to assess it based on your deeply held moral beliefs, you make a deservingness judgment. You look for deservingness cues, essentially. And the theory is that makes you more consistent morally than not doing that. But the research suggests the opposite. It makes you less consistent morally because the deservingness judgments actually crowd out your deeply held moral beliefs. So, and so even when there is enough information, if there are deservingness cues, it still short circuits your moral judgment, which is more of a problem for progressives, because progressives' moral judgments are less aligned with the judgments that normally arise when you have belief in deservingness, because belief in deservingness is tied to conservatism, status quo bias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are a liberal, progressive, et cetera, leftist, whatever, if you continue to believe in deservingness, it is going to undercut your ability to enact your moral consistently. And I have a really cool anti-woke based example if you're curious.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Just to throw the culture wars in here. There's an article that I reference in my section about tying luck pilling to social justice pedagogy, which I think we should do because I think social justice pedagogy is good. And one example where I show that it is better than the current version is in white privilege pedagogy, which I don't think I tell people on the internet what that is exactly, but there's this really cool study where they found that if you just do kind of entry-level white privilege pedagogy with liberals in particular, it's true for everybody, but especially for liberals, what happens is it turns liberals into conservatives with regards to poor white people.
Interesting.
So, so in general,
it's like they deserve, their position.
Right. Right, exactly. Conservatives are more likely to make deservingness attributions for poverty, broadly speaking. Liberals are less likely to do so, but become more likely to do so if you teach them white privilege pedagogy, because it then makes them think that those individuals deserve it because they didn't take advantage of their whiteness properly, essentially. Plus, I think it increases people's retributive desire when they are taught.
There's a story and some emotion, and
Right. So I argue that you need to be luck pilled about your approach to these things so that you're again, like you were saying, reinforcing the restorative approach to issues, not retributive approaches.
Right. Cool. And then, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, but some of the kind of broader political consequences of these views, then, obviously you've got a full episode on this on your podcast, but what are the kind of main take homes where, you want people to kind of clearly see the political consequences of this view? If you sort of maybe even if people buy into not everything that you've said, but some of the considerations are kind of maybe weakening their intuitions and things.
Yeah, meritocracy is bad. So most of the third chapter, the first half of it is like on the meritocracy illusion, because it very much is an illusion. But even if it wasn't, it's still aristocracy with better PR. There's just an overwhelming, I think, amount of research about the harms of, having the idea that people deserve their outcomes and that we should emphasize equality of opportunity and then let the chips kind of fall where they may. There's just so much evidence. So like meritocracy is sold on two things, much like the just world illusion. It's sold on fairness and efficiency, essentially,
Right.
fairness and control, right? So the fairness argument is false because it's based on the idea that meritocracy creates social mobility. It is, think of your classic meritocracy stories, your rags to riches, that kind of Horatio Alger story is not true for the vast majority of human beings, and no amount of pointing to counterexamples does anything about that. Specifically in the area of education, this is pretty heavily documented that like education is pointed to as the silver bullet for social mobility, except it does the opposite. It decreases social mobility because you get a system like we have where wealthy people can buy just more education, and B, more credentialing and connections. And so it doesn't work. And that's still just meritocracy. They're buying merit. They're not, even if you put aside all of the nepotism or anything like that and just let everybody spend their money on their children, the wealthy have better outcomes.
So is the core kind of intuition here something like when people tell these meritocracy stories, it's like the idea is that people get to the positions they do due to like abilities and capacities that they have. But when you actually look at the data around, where people end up in society in terms of their like economic background or like status and, education and stuff, it turns out that better predictors of those are things that are outside of their control, like how wealthy their parents were, where they were born, maybe even like ethnic background and stuff like that. And so it seems that the meritocracy story is just enabling like the continuation of that structure of like power relations or something. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's if you only buy half of what I'm saying, right? If you buy all of what I'm saying, then you have to include like Rawls's point that the capacity for effort is itself a kind of luck. It's constitutive luck that you're not suffering from some sort of congenitive birth defect where you can't work hard for extended periods of time. So everything is luck in that sense. No one deserves any kinds of outcomes. But even if you buy a much more reduced view, it's not working the way we claim it is, and it never will, because that's not how these systems work. You'd have to have, and the second half of the chapter is I lay out a sketch of an alternative, a kind of, I call it a lucktopia, just to acknowledge how like genuinely utopian what I'm going for is, though I think change is possible. As we've seen, meritocracy only took 100 years or so to take over the world, essentially. And I think it could be torn down just as quickly. So this recurring idea of deservingness has to be removed at every level. And I argue throughout for a needs-based approach as the alternative, essentially, specifically the needs that are required for human flourishing. So it is our obligation to meet the needs as best as we possibly can for every human being to flourish. We won't successfully do so for a variety of reasons, but we should recognize that when we fail to do so, it is a failure and not they deserve that, fuck them.
But if we did this, wouldn't we'd be redistributing our resources to a bunch of jobless people who don't want to work? But isn't it better that Elon Musk has the billions he does? Because he's building rockets that can be caught in a noodle arm, and that looks cool. So what's a few starving people who can't get healthcare if we can do that, or all the other cool stuff that he's doing?
Yeah, so it's no surprise that on this view, like billionaires are a policy failure, that wealth needs to be radically redistributed at a global level. I want to point out, I think when people think of redistribution, they're often thinking of it on a national level, but we're talking at a global level here. You're, I'm sure, familiar with all of the like economic arguments for why that redistribution would actually be better for everyone involved. But there's also, I think, it's worth noting the underlying philosophical debate here, which goes back to our Salvationists and goes back to a view of human nature that is deeply Malthusian. So in her book, Hijacked, which is excellent, everyone should read, Anderson talks about the split between the progressive Protestant work ethic and the conservative Protestant work ethic. The progressive one is very much what you were kind of thinking about in the universalist sense of, you know, we have an obligation to do work so that we can have excess, so that we can help those around us. And we have to meet all of their needs, and we will feel good for doing so. And that's why we will do it. We won't need to be motivated by a sense of scarcity. And then you have the conservatives like Malthus, who believe that human beings are essentially lazy and fallen and whatnot. And so if they are not kept in a state of precarity, they will not do the labor that is necessary for society to function. This leads to him basically arguing that the Irish should starve. Literally argues that the Irish should just starve. It would be better if they did, much like Hardin does many years later in the Tragedy of the Commons. So yeah, I think a lot of people do believe that, though. I do think like we have to acknowledge it is maybe the majority view of human beings that if you make life too good for humans, society will collapse.
I think that maybe this underpins, like, there's a joke my friend says that in America you're free to choose what bridge you want to starve under, and also, you know, there's this like Jordan Peterson thing that he always goes on about, which he claims is, I think, a Dostoevsky or Tolstoy quote, but I don't know that it is. And it's like, look, if you gave, you know, people everything that they wanted, you know, the first thing that they do is mess it all up, because it's just this like weird pictures of human nature as inherently kind of like combative. The world is this like nasty zero-sum place where everyone's and I think something here that undermined my intuitions on this is like reading more anthropology as well, because like David Graeber's work on this is like, if you actually just look outside of your immediate cultures, there's quite a lot of human cultures where it's just not like this, and it would be very unnatural to not be more collaborative or to you know, think in terms of the kind of things we might take as like a given here about human nature.
Yeah, and I cite Graeber as well when I talk about alternative approaches, and I do want to caveat that like it's very fascinating to watch the debate over anthropology through the lens of this being a debate essentially between Hobbesian worldviews and Rousseauian worldviews. Like, we're trying to argue what is human nature? Is human nature nasty, brutish, and short, or is human nature chill until society shows up? And the answer is it's both, right? It's a mix of a bunch of different, like, because it's a bunch of different tactics for different situations, right? So I don't think we should overstate the kind of noble savage view that I think some people take away from stuff like Graeber, where it's like, you know, things were much better before or something, and now they're
before iPhones.
Terrible. Right. Definitely not the case. Things were bad then, they've been bad forever, and they're probably going to keep being bad for a long time. Is generally my voidy view. But I do think that you're right that so I would point people also towards like just a refresher on basic evolutionary theory about fitness, right? Because I think when people think of survival of the fittest, they're thinking at a very individualistic level, which is related to the kind of weirdness, Western individualism mindset that just gives people the idea that you have to measure each individual's merit, right? And then, you know, that's who's going to survive and reproduce. Where the reality, as you point out, is like fitness is communal, right? If the community does well, individuals do well. And so, you know, collaborative skills are more likely to be fitness kind of skills. And that can help push people away from that terrifying worldview. And also, you know, like noting that human beings and like do intuitively want to be helpful. We are pro-social creatures by wiring. So if you give us things that we can do that can be helpful and then reinforce those things, you know, it is easy to make us good by habit, I think.
I suspect here as well that for some people's thinking on this, what they mean by like doing well is purely expressed in terms of some like economic abstraction, like a number like GDP or something like that, and probably it is a slightly impoverished view of like human flourishing compared to what you're maybe getting at and advocating for, right? Because I think that you would say if GDP goes up massively, but that means everyone is like incredibly miserable, that's not as good as, you know, GDP remaining neutral, but like measures of happiness or people getting access to education, things go up, because that's, you know, the purpose of society or of being it is not to be this economic machine, but it's to serve citizens and people and things. Or maybe, I mean, put that in your own words if I'm putting words in your mouth.
Well, no, yeah, Anderson has a great line about the real purpose of an economy is to make complete persons,
right?
Which is the flourishing view that I buy into. There's another quote that came up in my mind earlier when you were talking about what equality of opportunity means in America, right? This is kind of a Rawlsian quote where he says, like, it is the opportunity to leave the other people behind. Right.
Okay.
To like claw your way up the ladder while other people fail to do so. That is the ideal of the American dream. And then there's maybe something about turning around and helping other people sometimes. But I think also something you're pointing to here about the very thin account of human flourishing that a lot of people have. This is very much a product of meritocratic capitalism. One of the features of this system is that it crowds out intrinsic motivators. It makes it very hard to care about intrinsic motivators and replaces them with a bunch of extrinsic motivators like wealth or status or, you know, making, you know, when I talk about video games with my friends, I'm like, the goal of video games is not to win, it's to put up big numbers on the screen, right? Like that's the kind of place that people can get into in this stuff where it's just like, all I care about are bigger numbers. You know, I got to get that extra billion or whatever. So I do think if you, and that ties into the meaning making crisis, right? If you are deprived of intrinsic motivation and you're stuffed full of extrinsic motivators, you feel empty. It's empty calories, right? Meaning wise. And so you have people going through these meaning crises. And that's why people who are engaging in January 6th aren't low income, low status individuals. They are middle income, middle status individuals a lot of the time who feel like they're not the high status that they want to be. And the reason is because of those people. So yeah, I think we can try to fix that problem along with these other ones and help people have a better sense of meaning.
Yeah, I've seen like a horrible irony in the kind of like contemporary politics where some of the people getting the most radicalized in the direction of like the most harmful views that are involved in like denying that climate change exists or denying, you know, like globalism is international efforts are needed to solve like really big problems we face and things. A lot of the people going in that direction are like the biggest victims of the system, like exploiting them and making them feel lost and you know, such that they feel this need for a sense of control by explaining the world in terms of like conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum and stuff like that. But I was wondering though, obviously the political consequences of your views then are very like radical from where we're at now, as you kind of accept and say. Are there any like pragmatic, practical steps that would be the kind of immediate upshot of your views that you'd want people that people who kind of like buy these views can go in if they're thinking about these things, if they accept some of them, that tangibly kind of like manifest themselves in how, you know, maybe people's personal conduct or their political actions?
Yeah. So let me just first at least make a nod towards the feasibility argument that I think there's a reasonable concern of feasibility, that like where I don't take demandingness to be an objection in philosophy, I recognize that it's more of a problem in politics, essentially, right? What I say is I'm not gonna claim feasibility immediately or claim that there's an easy step-by-step process to get from where we are here now to this. What I do argue is that this is where we should be trying to get to, and that feasibility is a more messy concept than people are willing to admit. And I give the example of gay marriage. Gay marriage was not politically feasible when I was young in America. Like, not only was it not legal, it was not a conversation, right? And over the course of our lives, it became not just politically feasible, but the political norm. Meritocracy did the same thing in about 100 years. So political feasibility may change faster than people think. So that's why I don't want to necessarily spend too much time on it, because I think it can be a lot more uncertain than we want to say. But tangible steps is a really important piece for me here. In the politics chapter, I go through various kinds of things. I go through different areas in which I think a society has to address problems, which are resource allocation, role allocation, criminal justice, and meaning making. In the areas of resource allocation, we've already talked about things like radical wealth redistribution. If you're a political person and political activist pushing for things like universal basic income, pushing for things like universal access to basic needs, those are the places that I think we have to make progress if we're going to achieve any of the other things. So feasible or not, those are the key first steps. But like, the reason this is an education dissertation ultimately is because I think we have to, as much as education can't fix all our problems, it is, I think, a big part of the first step, which is re-educating people to think differently about these issues, and then they will behave differently politically, hopefully, right? So in the education section, I go through a bunch of different practices. Some of them are, pure luck pilling stuff, like the regress argument we did earlier. Some of them are kind of mindfulness based, because I think luck pilling itself is a mindfulness practice, but I integrate it with various mindfulness practices around things like gratitude. So a good thing that individuals can do is unwire their sense of deservingness and unwire their sense of the fundamental attribution error, which is the fancy term for, if I cut you off in traffic, it's because I'm late and it's okay. And if you cut me off, it's because you're an asshole. We can fix that by remembering luck, right? Reminding ourselves that, like, when other people act, even when they act badly, not just saying, oh, he actually did something that was moral every single time, but even when you say someone did something badly, recognizing that it's bad moral luck on their part. They were not taught better. They didn't have the correct motivations. They were weak of, like, all sorts of different reasons that can come in there, and recognizing that things are worse for them than for you, in the sense that they are immoral individuals leading immoral lives, and that is, I think, a worse life to lead. So yeah, I do put forward a couple of different practices in there, and we could dive into more if folks want, but I don't want to talk too much.
It's all good. How are you doing for time, by the way? Are you
I'm
okay
fine
to take some audience questions? Okay, great.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, won't go on forever, but there are a few audience questions, and maybe a few more will come in, because I've said I'm taking audience questions, so that might prompt someone.
I already defended, so I get all the time in the world.
So, Reflective Journey says, have you looked into free energy accounts of agency? Personally, I don't exactly know what they mean. It sounds maybe like a heterodox physics position or something.
Is this quantum?
I don't know, so I can't really say.
Can they say if it's quantum?
Yeah, they'll probably say in the chat in a second. But I'm guessing it's going to be like an account of libertarian agency in terms of like physics or something, but I don't know.
This says our brains are constantly trying to minimize surprise or uncertainty by making predictions about our environment and taking actions to align with those predictions.
Okay, that sounds less weird than quantum.
I mean, that sounds true in principle, but not. I don't understand how you apply that to free will. I'm just looking at the wiki.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
There's math.
Well, we can leave that one if they say something.
I think like generally I can broadly answer this question in the sense of, I don't think there's scientific solutions to the problem of free will, because I think the problem of free will is not about the nature of the particles in the universe or the particles in our brain or anything like that. It's that problem of reasons regress thing earlier. As long as what you're looking for is that someone acted from reasons, but that those reasons didn't win out because of things beyond their control, I just don't think you're ever going to find that anywhere. Right. That's not an empirical thing to find.
So there's a second question here, which is, does your view require some form of incompatibilism to be true about free will? And then, actually, if you want to just answer that, and then maybe I can follow that up with something as well.
So yeah, like, my view is a form of incompatibilism in the sense that I think free will is incompatible with the pervasiveness of luck. Right. Luck pervades the universe. There's no room in the universe for free will. As Nagel puts it, the space for free agency shrinks to an extensionless point. So if we get into incompatibilism in the language of determinism versus indeterminism, then I'm what you would call a hard determinist, in the sense that I don't think it matters if it's deterministic or indeterministic. There's still no free will. But yeah, I think there's no room for free will, and there's no reason to use the concept of free will. I do talk about how that's different from the concept of agency in the psychological literature and in our minds, that like you can still have more or less of agency, in the sense of, if you're not locked in chains or forced to work in a camp, like you can freely move about and make decisions. So, but agency is about being motivated by the right kinds of intrinsic motivators. It's not free will, because it's still a matter of luck whether you have those intrinsic motivators and are in a situation where you get to act on them.
And then, so the sort of like second question that's maybe embedded in this that I was thinking of, and I'm thinking of this on the spot, so it might not be particularly coherent, is something like, have you engaged with anyone coming at this from like a luck compatibilism angle? So, maybe they're thinking that there are like legitimate uses of luck that are compatible with some of the reasons bottoming out in things that aren't creditable to the person. So I'm not sure if there would be some general principle of like, but they were acting in accordance with something, like in the sense of like the compatibilist response in the free will debate is to say like, look, the relevant sense of freedom is they're acting in accordance with their desires, right? And so I'm thinking like, maybe that it's like they're acting in accordance with their desires still. Well, would it be that quite? I'm thinking like, what would that look like in the luck debate to be like a luck compatibilist?
So luck egalitarians are luck compatibilists, essentially.
Okay, right.
And I had on my committee someone who had published an argument that I argue against in the dissertation as my example of why I think compatibilism is wrong, where they take the luck egalitarian distinction between brute luck and option luck. So brute luck is the luck that is beyond your control and you shouldn't suffer as a result of in any way or be held responsible for. And then they try to argue that option luck or choice luck is the kind of luck that you can and should be held responsible for. So that's the distinction they make. And he pressed me a lot to try to, to push me to show that what I was doing is not just an extreme form of luck egalitarianism. And I don't think it is, because the luck egalitarians are specifically interested in preserving the concept of deservingness and responsibility by preserving this distinction between brute luck and option luck. Whereas on my view, the distinction collapses if you take seriously the regress problem that I was talking about, that like, and another related thesis that it's luck either way. So I think there's a good related intuition that if something happens to you, the fact that that happened to you and not something else is itself a result of luck. And if the other thing had happened, it would have also been luck in that sense. So even if you believe, as some do, that you have choice, that you could have chosen otherwise, if you had chosen otherwise, that still would have been the result of luck. So I'm separate from the luck egalitarians in that way. They are certainly trying to be compatibilists in the way you're describing, but the problem is they don't have an answer to the pervasiveness. They don't have an answer to the control condition, essentially. So they essentially have to wave away the intuition that you can't be held responsible for things that are beyond your control. And Dennett in particular does this. In Elbow Room, if you read it, he straight up is like, we're just going to assume that things kind of work out in the end because like we need to preserve this for the sake of preserving, weirdly enough, deterrence-based approaches to criminal justice, which is false.
Okay, yeah, I need to read up on some of the literature you're referring to here, because I'm just definitely not as up to date on any of this stuff as you are. But some useful platforms to jump off of. Paradix asks, slightly unrelated to this topic, but you have both criticized Peter Boghossian. Actually, I will say, many years ago, maybe 4 or 5 now, I was having Peter Boghossian on, and you were the first person who said, "Hey, you might want to look into this guy's background a little bit."
Back when people would tell me that I should stop doing guilt by association on James Lindsay, those were the days.
Yeah. and obviously, I think things have got much more transparent now as to the problems with some of these people and the funding sources and the political goals. But he's gotten to a really scary point, requesting to be a part of Trump's cabinet. In your view, is there anything that can be done about this? And just to kind of add, I don't know if you've continued to follow the story, but it's like obviously he's like very upset with Portland State University and stuff that happened there. Whether or not, I mean, I think maybe some of that's legitimate. I also think some of that is like he kind of has fabricated certain aspects of the story to build his profile in a particular kind of way, as like a Cassandra. And yeah, so he has been talking recently about the fact that we should burn down the entire US education system, because it's so ran through with CRT and wokeness and stuff like that, and then obviously asking to be a part of the political cabinet, which plausibly could have a mandate and the power to do that from the most recent election as well, or something like that. I don't know what the checks would be though in the US political system. So what are your suggestions for concerned Americans?
Well, first of all, I think it's optimistic to think that Peter Boghossian is going to get Chris Rufo's job. I think if anybody's getting that job, it's Chris Rufo, since he's already been to the White House to talk to Trump about CRT and is the architect of the CRT moral panic and has those connections much better than Peter does, as far as I know. But yeah, what can you do about it? You other than having not elected Trump? Well, let's say, look, there's at least somewhat success rate for enough credible accusations of sexual misconduct that seems to remove people from contention. So if that's an option, maybe that's a good way to go. But other than that, not really. Buckle up. It's going to be 4 years of the worst people being in charge of stuff, because that's how elections work in this context.
Yeah. Interestingly as well, I actually met with someone who filmed a series for Boghossian, Lindsay, and Pluckrose around the time that they did the grievance study stuff. Yeah, and they told me that there was a specific moment where James Lindsay realized the funding sources, and this is his description, so maybe it could be wrong, maybe it's hyperbole. He said, and Lindsay was like white as a ghost and was just like realizing, experiencing, you might say, like the dissonance between maybe his personal values as a liberal and caring about truth and stuff, and like realizing the political levers and stuff. This is around like 2015 time, something before Trump's initial term.
Yeah, so. Not to get too far into the weeds, but last I looked, they were denying any they refused to make clear who had funded them on that. But it did happen right around the time where sovereign nations started supporting them pretty heavily and had that conference that they invited them to in London and set up new discourses for James Lindsay and all that stuff. So let me put it this way. If he was concerned about it, he wasn't so concerned that he didn't mind being flown out to some fancy vistas to take lengthy videos with Michael O'Fallon, where he explains that Marxism and CRT are the result of communist weakening the West and stuff. Yeah.
So back onto the topic anyway of today's discussion. So Harry, and hey Harry watching, has writing your thesis changed how you think about things and or how you act?
This is a really interesting question. I wrote a Skeptic Mag article about disbelief in free will, and the fact that, as someone who I think I don't believe in free will, but I also recognize the flaws of introspection, and do my best to act in such a way where I don't act as if I believe in free will, but have had many people tell me that I still believe in free will, much the same way people will tell you still believe in God, even though you're an atheist. And people will tell me that you can't internalize a no free will view, or you can't act on it consistently or something like that. So that caveat, I do think that it does change my behavior. I think that it has helped me to do the things that I say it helps me to do in the dissertation, be more functional around gratitude and humility and compassion, and be more able to do the kind of social emotional learning stuff like self-regulating and being and better understanding social justice issues, and being better able to address them and respond consistently and not slip back into retributive places. But I think that stuff is, it was going on before the dissertation, and convinced me that like this was the right direction to go in, partially because I could feel like there were impacts there. And like I always feel very weird talking about this stuff, because you're saying, oh, I've gotten so much more humble because of this, which is a very weird argument to make.
Yeah,
but there are tests of humility, and like I do think some people are more humble, and humble here just means more accurate about your self-assessments most of the time. It just means you neither overplay nor underplay. It's not the faux, oh, I'm not really this good at this thing that I'm clearly actually good at. It's like being consistent about it. And I do think that recognizing that your successes and your failures are the result of luck helps you with that. So I have also heard from other people that they have found it helpful in these various kind of ways. Again, this is not peer-reviewed research, so like until I have that peer-reviewed research, I'm not going to make any stronger claims. I do think it is, like, doing the research has convinced me that there's a lot more good psychological support for my intuitions about this stuff, and a lot of political stuff hanging in the balance.
Right. So that is it for questions, but I think it's probably feel free if there's anything.
There's just a few comments in there that I want to mention real quick.
Yeah, no
Someone pointing out that the regress argument is cheating because it's too atomic. Yeah. And like, I don't think the complexity changes the problem at all. Like, whether it's continuous, it's still causally going to have the same reality of like you're acting on reasons, and you're you're habituating yourself as you do so, whether it's I don't see how there's a real change there if it's more continuous over time. Maybe you have more of an intuition that there's a difference there, but
I'm trying to think what the objection maybe is getting at, like, that model of action is like mistaken or something. Do you think, like, it's saying it's not the case, like that model of agency of like I've got like a table of reasons and I choose on behalf of them is like a mistaken view of agency, and so the kind of story and the argument doesn't work? Or I don't know.
I mean, maybe, but basically that's the best case scenario for free will people, right? Like, if it's anything less than that, it's just going to get worse for them, because then, like, well, we can say what it's like. There's a bunch of forces, and then behavior bubbles up from them, and then you rationalize it after the fact, right? That's a common view of human behavior, right? That's not a better view for free will. That's not helping anybody on that front.
Well,
I'm
trying to think like maybe they just have a different account. It wouldn't salvage like free will in like a libertarian sense or something, I guess, but maybe there'd be like some other account that's compatible with that.
It still seems like you're just saying I'm giving a scenario in which optimistically, at least something is under your control, in the sense that you're choosing your reasons for actions. If the argument is actually it's worse, you're not even getting to do that much, then I'm like, okay, it's still going to be a luck-pilled position, because all of those forces inside of you are still just luck all the way down. I just use the very simplified regress argument, A, because a lot of people believe that's how their actions work, and B, because it sort of gets across the intuition that you're never going to find a sturdy grounding for deservingness.
Right. Well, in terms of sorry, did you want to comment on
if you want to wrap up, feel free. Like philosophers will go forever, so
so I was gonna say, obviously if people want to hear more about this, is it 5 or 6 part series that you're doing on your podcast?
It'll end up being 6-part with the Q&A, because we did an intro chapter episode, and then an episode for each of the 4 chapters, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. And
it's actually a result of listening to that I've chosen to check out that Responsible Creators Content Network thing as well. I thought that's a pretty cool idea. So
awesome. Yeah, I very much appreciate that. And if folks are interested, if I could just plug that a little bit real quick. So when I'm not doing this stuff, when I'm doing this stuff, because it's a restorative justice organization, I'm also an ethics director at the Creator Accountability Network, where we help creators in their communities to engage in healthy, safe, ethical ways. And we're always looking for creators who are interested in promoting those kind of values within their communities who want to sign up, as well as community members who want to sign up to do volunteering or anything like that.
And is the general idea of the network, like how does it work for people? Like what are their goals?
Yeah, so essentially what we have is, and this is to our knowledge, a somewhat novel system that was pulled together from a couple of different other things a little bit. Creators come in and get credentialed, go through a basic ethics training where they learn about the code of conduct that we uphold as an organization that we're asking them to uphold, and specifically with regard to content creation and harassment and abuse, which is the sort of behavior out of which our organization originates. If they agree to do so and promote our system, they promote that we have a reporting system where if they do something that people feel like is a violation of our code of conduct, they can make a report. It will go through our restorative justice process where people will be helped to make sure the issue gets addressed properly. The goal here is to sort of catch issues before they become persistent problems, because people, in the current system, there's no one to go to if a behavior is problematic. At best, you can go to like other creators who work with them, but those people are neither trained nor in a good position to address the issue. So we've tried to create a system where there are a lot of benefits to this as well. Then creators, as you see here, like creators want to collaborate with other creators, but it's always a roll of the dice when you do so, as you mentioned with your previous experience with Peter. Having an organization where you can be like, well, these people are held to the same standard, I can have them on my show without concern, creates a really nice ethical networking situation.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a pretty cool idea as well for those reasons. So, and obviously people can check out Embracing the Void and Philosophers in Space, right? Your podcasts if they want to hear more. Thanks everyone for watching, and share the video around if you think it would be useful to look pill someone, and comment on the video to help promote the engagement and stuff as well, because it just helps it get around into people's feeds. Thanks everyone. Bye.